As you look up on the screen this morning and you look at this morning's, the title of this morning's message, the Vahen Faith, well, first, if you don't know Hebrew well enough, that's going to mean nothing to you. But even if you do, what the message and what the focus of today's message is going to be may not be abundantly clear to begin with, but we're going to go in this morning, and by the end, certainly, I hope you have a new understanding or appreciation for faith and a specific type of faith that I'm going to be discussing and covering this morning. Vahen la, or in translated in the English, meaning but if not. So in English, if we made this completely English, it would be but if not faith. Sounds a little strange to the ear when you first hear it, and especially if you don't see any punctuation. In reality, but if not faith could have several different meanings. And so in order to be clear right from the beginning, I want to inform you that this phrase, but if not faith, or Vahen la faith, it's meant to describe a particular type of faith. The one that all who follow Yeshua are required to demonstrate. As such, in this short, in English foreword, using the Hebrew three-word phrase, the segment but if not, or the Vahen la, is to serve as an adjective that modifies the noun. So the Vahen la, or the but if not, is modifying the concept of faith. Now, this little grammar explanation that I give of the title, it might be somewhat helpful in bringing light to this morning's message. You're still going to be in the dark if you don't know where this phrase "but if not" comes from. If you're not familiar what "but if not," three very short English words, seems like, well, can't be that important. Where does this phrase come from? Now, I'm not going to give you the ultimate phrase first, but those of you who might be history buffs may actually be familiar with this phrase, especially those of you who know anything about World War II. But if not was the one SOS message that British troops were able to get out on the shore. They were trapped on the shores of Dunkirk in 1940 and were completely surrounded by the German Nazi army. And this was the one message that they were able to get out. It was a very simple SOS message that said, "But if not." However, that sounds kind of strange if you're not familiar with this story, but for the Brits at the time who received the message and then responded to the message, it's clearly evident what this meant. And the good news about the Battle of Dunkirk is the Brits were able to send ships and evacuate the 350,000 British troops who were going to be annihilated by the Nazi army. But what did this message mean? Why would they respond to something that simply said, "but if not"? Well, we've got to remember that going back to 1940, you had a more biblically literate generation, people who were more common to be in the church, who have read the word and would recognize this "but if not" phrase and what it actually conveyed. It was a message that conveyed the idea of a faith that could withstand temporary victory or defeat. In other words, the ability to stand in faith was there, remained there regardless of the outcome of that day's events. So for the British, it was an SOS saying, even if you don't come and rescue us, remain strong. Even if the Nazi army defeats us in this moment, that doesn't matter that we should lose hope or we should give up the fight. You continue to fight. This phrase, "but if not," if you don't know the biblical origin and what this SOS was referencing, it comes from the book of Daniel. And it's one of the greatest demonstrations of faith that you see in the entire Tanakh. And it was uttered by three men who were about to be thrown into a fiery furnace. So now, if you haven't been with me till then, hopefully being thrown in the fiery furnace gives you an idea of what I'm referencing here. It's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we're not going to read the whole story, and I know it's familiar to most, but just to refresh some of the basics about the story. Must remember these were three Jewish men who lived in the court of Nebuchadnezzar during the Babylonian exile. And Nebuchadnezzar, who was king of Babylon, and in essence king of the entire world as the world was defined by the Middle East in that time period, Nebuchadnezzar decided that he would construct an idol of gold. And he commanded that at any time that a certain music was to play, everyone in the kingdom, or at least everyone there in Babylonia who would hear the music playing, was to fall down and worship the idol. And he said that the punishment for failing to obey this command, to fall down and worship the idol at the appointed times, was that the offenders would be thrown into a fiery furnace and burnt to death. Now, of course, to Daniel and to these three other Jews who resided in the court, this was not possible. This would have been a violation of Torah to do that. And when they didn't follow the command, the Chaldeans who were opposed to these Jewish men in the court, the Chaldeans being natives of the land of Babylon, modern-day Iraq, and having high positions in the court, and opposed them, they saw this. And so they decided to point out to Nebuchadnezzar that these, now Daniel isn't mentioned in the story, but it's assumed Daniel wouldn't have been violating the Torah either. But they go to Nebuchadnezzar and they bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before him, and they inform him that they refused to worship the golden image. And we read this in Daniel 3:13-15, which says,
Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?
So in these words spoken by the king of Babylon, we see a direct challenge to the sovereignty and the power of God. Nebuchadnezzar had conceived in his mind that he himself was a god, being the mightiest king of earth in that day. And he questioned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as to why they could believe that their God, the God of Israel, would be able to rescue them out of his hands. And this attitude is not surprising, as the common thought in these ancient times was that who had the more powerful God was often decided on the battlefield. And if one kingdom was able to come in and either conquer or subjugate another, it was a sign that the victorious kingdom's God was the superior one. Therefore, for Nebuchadnezzar, in his mind, he most likely reasoned that since he had been given victory over the Jews, and actually over all of the kingdoms that surrounded the Jews at this time, and he had brought these three Jews, including Daniel, but at least 4 Jews, into his court to serve him, and that the fact that they served him as administrators and now they stood before him, in his mind he would have thought that he himself, or at least the gods that the Babylonians served, had to be superior to the God of Israel. And therefore, to see these men deny his commandment, his requirement that they bow to this idol, was for them to place their faith in a God that had shown not to be powerful. And what Nebuchadnezzar had failed to realize in all of this is that he himself was merely a clay vessel in the hands of God, in the potter. And that he was simply being used as a tool by God to bring judgment on the kingdom of Judah, who had broken their covenant, had fallen into idolatry long before Nebuchadnezzar was even born. Now we see Nebuchadnezzar's role in that he was simply a tool or instrument being used by God in Jeremiah 21:3-7, which says,
But Jeremiah answered them, Tell Zedekiah, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I'm about to turn against you the weapons of war that are in your hands, which you are using to fight the king of Babylon and the Babylonians who are outside the wall besieging you. And I will gather them inside this city. I myself will fight against you with an outstretched hand and a mighty arm, in furious anger and in great wrath. I will strike down those who live in this city, both man and beast, and they will die of a terrible plague. After that, declares the Lord, I will give Zedekiah king of Judah, his officials, and the people in this city who survived the plague, sword and famine, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and to their enemies who want to kill them. He will put them to the sword, and he will show them no mercy or pity or compassion.
Now, in light of these circumstances, and the fact that God had delivered the Jews over to the Babylonians as punishment for their wayward ways, for breaking the covenant that God had made with their ancestors at Sinai, When you think about that, that's what was occurring. So even beyond what Nebuchadnezzar's misunderstanding, that simply he himself or he served a stronger God than the God of Israel, but in this understanding that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would have held, that they would have understood that this punishment, that the fact that they were in captivity and the fact that they stood before Nebuchadnezzar, now having violated the king's command and knowing that their lives were forfeit because of this, shows a remarkable amount of faith in God that each of these three had to have held, and that we today need to seek to emulate. Because even though the covenant had been broken with the southern kingdom, and they had been punished because of that breaking of the covenant, these three men still understood that the covenant stood, and that individually they each had to still respond to that covenant. And Daniel 3:16 through 17 gives their response that was spoken in this faith.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand.
And of course, we know what the rest of the story is. We know what the response is and what occurs after they respond this way to the king. These three men are thrown into the fiery furnace, but they're also preserved in the fiery furnace, even though that furnace was heated to 7 times more than what was normal. And it was so hot that when the flames actually engulfed the men who had threw these three men into it. Yet they came out of them not only without being singed at all, but it says, and we're not going to read these verses because of time, but it says that in fact that they couldn't even smell the fire that they had passed through. The smoke that you would have associated with the fire wasn't even on them. But from this story, we see how three men showed a great trust in the sovereignty, the power of God over them. And how they proclaimed to this king, to Nebuchadnezzar, who believed that he held the power of life and death over them. They proclaimed that they would not bow to his idol because their God would rescue them out of his hands. And they did so at the risk of their own lives. They proclaimed that God was superior to the ruler of the most powerful nation on the entire earth. And God rewarded them for such faith by performing a miracle, sending an angel who was in the fire with them and delivered them out of it. And this is where I would argue that most readers are content to stop with this story and with the history of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They see a great display of faith in the defiance of a king. They stay loyal to the commandments, and they're rewarded. They're rescued out of it. And people who simply end the story here, they take great comfort that God has responded to this expression of the men's faith, and that he did display his sovereignty over the Babylonians. In fact, he displayed his sovereignty over the very laws of nature. For many modern Christians, this is a story of great comfort, for it demonstrates the rewards of faith that if you remain faithful to the true God and to his promises. However, I would argue there is even a greater demonstration of faith by these three men that is entirely missed if we leave the story at this point. What we would be missing is their demonstration of but if not faith, or the vahinu la faith. For although, yes, they did proclaim their faith that God had sovereignty over Nebuchadnezzar and even over the laws of nature, and they actually proclaimed something even greater than this about their faith in God. For after stating that God was able to deliver them from the furnace and the Babylonian king, they said the following in Daniel 3:18.
But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up.
Now, Brian read from the New King James Version. I forgot to tell him to read from the King James for this one verse because it said, what was it? What's the first phrase? But even if not. So the King James is but if not. That's why, though, I went to the Hebrew for the title today, because vahin la, that's the Hebrew. That doesn't change regardless of what translation you're looking at. Vahin la faith, the faith that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego demonstrated in these two Hebrew words. Vahin la, but if not. And what they were saying in that simple phrase was that even if God did not deliver them out of their situation, they acknowledged that God had the power to do so. But even if God didn't, they still wouldn't bow to the golden image. After having proclaimed God's ability to rescue them, they followed up by declaring that their faithfulness to God and their refusal to violate his commandments and worship the graven image was not based upon their belief of such a rescue, or on a belief that if they demonstrated faith in God, they would receive a reward. Maybe not in this life, but at least after the resurrection. Rather, their faith was grounded upon something much greater than this. It was based simply on that if God had given commandments, that simply because God was sovereign over Israel and he was their God, they were to obey it. It didn't matter if they were rescued or not, they were to obey. In this declaration of faith, they did not view God as an entity with whom they could bargain or negotiate. Unlike many today, especially those who follow false hopes and teachings that you find such as in the prosperity movement, they didn't approach God with an attitude saying that if I step out in faith or if I do what is commanded, then God owes me something. Whether that something be riches, fame, healing, a divine power, whatever it might be. Their mindset was not that, hey, God, look at me, I'm standing here for your name, I'm standing here in front of this great king, so you have to help me out. That wasn't their attitude. Instead, they showed an even greater faith to God, a greater allegiance to God, and that they would not violate God's commandments because simply it would be the wrong thing to do. It would be the evil, the unholy thing to do. Their obedience was an acknowledgement of faith in God's holiness and in the righteousness of his commandments, and in his sovereignty over all things. Because he deserved their obedience, they obeyed. And this is the greater faith, the faith which all of us should demonstrate, of which I referred to earlier. The faith that I mean when I say, but if not, faith. It is a faith that allows us to say, God, I will show obedience to you, not out of a fear of a fiery furnace, or even a fiery afterlife, not out of a desire to receive riches on earth or blessings in heaven, but I am going to show obedience to you because I know you are righteous and you desire me to be righteous as well. And please understand, this is not to say that those other things are not true and that those other consequences may not be a result of showing one's faith or a lack of faith. But that for the mature follower of Yeshua, the consequences become secondary to simply having a relationship with God. Obedience should not be seen as a burden to avoid punishment or as a blessing even to receive additional blessings. But rather, obedience comes easily simply because we should love him. As simple as it is, John 14:15 says it all.
If you love me, keep my commands.
It is not, Yeshua in these words, he's not saying, if you are to avoid punishment, keep my commands. Nor is it saying, if you want to be blessed, keep my commandments. It is simply, if you love me, keep my commandments. Now, those of you who are parents should understand this sense of love immediately, the sense of love that God is looking for. You hope your children listen to your instructions. They obey the rules that you establish for them. They follow your commandments. Not because you hope, as a father or mother, not because you're hoping to avoid having to punish them if they don't obey. Not because you want to lavish gifts or words of praise upon them because they do what you tell them. But you simply want your children to show obedience because they love you and they trust you. And they trust that you love them enough, that you always have their best interest in mind. And what you tell them and what you instruct them to do, that it's out of love from yourself and they're responding actually to you, to your love as a parent. Personally, this is something I've only really come to fully appreciate as Hyla, my daughter, has grown in age. Now at about 2.5, she can understand now a lot of what is being asked of her most of the time. And when there is an immediate response from her in obedience to what I ask or what Shelley asks, I do see it as an expression of love by her, an expression of trust in her directed towards me. It's that I do trust you, Dad, I do trust you, Mom, to have my best interests in mind, and so I simply obey. Such a desire to see loving obedience from our children is what God desires for those who belong to him. A faith that rests upon the relationship between him and his creation. Not a faith that relies upon the negative or the positive consequences of that relationship. Now, in the parashah the last 3 weeks, we have seen the consequences of a lack of faith in the relationship between God and his elect repeated over and over and over again. In fact, it is sadly a consistent theme woven throughout the entire book of Numbers, or in the Hebrew, Bamidbar. And I think the Hebrew word here is much better in encapsulating the entire book of Bamidbar, that Bamidbar meaning in the wilderness. It's a much more fitting title than what we have in the English calling it Numbers. The reason being is the entire book is about the wilderness experience. And unfortunately, part of that experience does appear to be a lack of faith that often rises when you're going through that wilderness experience and you're being refined by God and you're being disciplined and you're being brought into maturity. This is a much more deeper meaning that comes from this book than simply the census that's contained into it, in which the English name, the book derives its name from. So what are some of the instances? Well, 2 weeks ago, we read the first instance, and probably the most striking and the one that we see this teaching from today in the most. We see it in this lack of faith by the Israelites. Having given Israel the instructions of the covenant at Sinai, God now commanded them to move away from Sinai. And he led them to the southern border of the land that he had promised Abraham. Following God's instructions, Moshe sends out 12 spies to survey the land and report to the children of Israel about what they found. We hear the report of 10 of the 12 spies in Numbers 13, 25 through 29, and 32 through 33.
At the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak, come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them.
Now look at the report. The interesting thing about this report is that we see that actually the 10 spies don't lie, nor do they seek to deceive the other children of Israel. After all, they gave a positive report about the land. They said that, yes, it does flow with milk and honey, that it is a prosperous land. And their comments about the inhabitants were not a fabrication either, considering that various Canaanite tribes did have great armies and that they did occupy the land. The problem with their report and the resulting plot by the Israelites that followed in an attempt to overthrow Moshe and to return to Egypt was their lack of faith, and specifically their lack of vehinlah faith. The Israelites failed to trust in the sovereignty of God and in the relationship that Elohim had forged with them through the covenant at Sinai. Doubt and a yearning to return to the relative safety of Egypt overshadowed any faith they might have had in God. And it did so because they failed to have faith in the love of God for Israel, which had brought his protection over them. And think about it. They had already seen how God acted and could act against Egypt. Egypt, the most powerful nation at that time. They had seen Pharaoh humbled by the 10 plagues. They had seen Pharaoh's army destroyed by the splitting of the Red Sea and then it filling in behind them as they escaped. They had seen the power of God at Sinai as they stood at the foot and the commandments were delivered to them. They understood the power of the God that was with them. So why would there be a lack of faith? It had to be not in the power of God so much, but in the love of God and the relationship of God. Would God continue to protect them as they went into the land? Would they see those same miracles and that same divine protection that they saw in Egypt? And when they first came out, would they see that continue in the land? That seems to be where their faith must have been wavering. Now, in contrast to this attitude among the Israelites, we see, of course, Caleb and Joshua, who demonstrated that but if not faith, that ve'hein la faith, which is to say they demonstrated a faith of obedience that was grounded in a relationship between God and Israel. The words of their faith are shown in Numbers 13:30.
Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it."
And again in Numbers 14:6-9.
Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into the land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them."
In the first of these two passages, we see the faithful zeal of Caleb to obey God. As he heard the other spies begin to give their report of the numerous tribes that inhabited the land, he interrupted them and called for the Israelites to go up immediately and possess the land. His faith in God was simply to hear the promises, to hear the commandments, and obey. In the second passage, we are given more insight as to why Caleb and Joshua possessed such a faith. In verse 8 is declared that if the Lord delighted in them, he would give them the land. Now the word delight there, hafetz in the Hebrew, means there is a feeling of strong positive attraction for something, a sense of affection for something or someone. So they're saying that the Lord would delight in them. If the Lord has this positive attraction, this strong affection for them, they will be given victory. So their faith that led them to obedience to possess the land rested on their belief that the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, was a God with whom they not only had entered into a contractual covenant relationship, but a true affectionate relationship in which that God would remain with them. Because they trusted in this relationship, they trusted that God had a deep affection for his chosen people, they were able to obey God's commandments, for they recognized the holiness of God first to keep his promises, and the righteousness of his commandments to keep Israel within his protection. And also they understood the sovereignty of God to carry out both his promises and the loving protection that he desired to put over Israel. Unfortunately, Israel would not learn quickly from the discipline that would be extolled upon them for their lack of faith and obedience at this time with the spies. Because they did not listen to Caleb and they did not listen to Joshua, they didn't listen to Moses either. They would be punished, or they'd have to wander the wilderness for 40 years. And there would be a loss essentially of 2 entire generations during that time. 2 generations that would fail to enter the promised land because anyone over the age of 20 was except for Joshua and Caleb, it was forbidden. As we have seen last week and this week in the parashahs, the Israelites would again and again fail to show obedient faith unto God. And it would be seen in the murmuring and the complaining against God and against Moses. We saw it in Korah's rebellion 2 weeks ago. Or a week ago, I should say, and the murmuring of the people who complained against those who opposed Moses. Remember, after Korah and Korah's allies were swallowed up by the earth because of their disobedience and going against God's selected and anointed prophets. People then complained against Moshe. They continued to complain. That wasn't enough to silence them. Other people then rose up and complained against Moses, saying, "You've struck in God's own people. What have you done?" And therefore, they were punished even further by a plague that was put upon them. We saw that again this week in the parashah. We see it, how the people would lack faith. They would lack that God would provide, would protect them because of his affectionate relationship and love for them. We saw in Numbers 22-5 and again in 21:4-6.
Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died.
Now, these two passages we just read, and we read in the parashah, but one thing you have to realize in the parashah isn't necessarily evident immediately is that after the commandment of the red heifer, which we're not going to go into today, but it's a very significant teaching and has been taught from this bema many times, after that there's a jump in time, and you actually jump to near the end of the 40 years. There's actually a passage about 37 or 38 of the 40 years in the jump when we get to the story of Moses and the rock, and how the people murmured and complained there. And that, as you can see, because they had to go around the land of Edom, because Edom would not allow them to pass through. This is now near the end of the 40 years. So even after 40 years of being tried and being disciplined in the wilderness, you see the people still haven't changed. You see they still murmur. They're still looking back to Egypt. They still lack that faith, a faith which can only be grounded in a relationship with God. In each of these instances, we see a lack of faith in God's promises and in his sovereignty. But again, why this lack of faith there? Ultimately, it's because they lacked faith in the relationship that God had forged with them. Those who murmured against the Lord not only lacked the faith to trust God's ability to see them through the difficulties of the wilderness, but they lacked that faith that we saw earlier from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were not able to stand and say before the Lord and before Moses, they weren't able to stand there and say, we're going to remain obedient to the commandments and to what God instructs us to do simply because we have a relationship with the Lord. And regardless of whether God preserves us as individuals or not here in the wilderness and during our wanderings, it doesn't matter. We're still going to remain obedient. They failed to do that, unfortunately. Now, the demonstration of this obedient faith that acts solely on the recognition of who God is and what our relationship with God is, we find it in the New Testament as well. This isn't simply something that is demonstrated in the Tanakh. We certainly see it in one of the greatest examples, we see one of the greatest examples of this in the Gentile centurion who asked Yeshua to heal his servant. Luke 7, 1-8 says the following.
When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. There a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it."
So in these words that are being spoken to Yeshua, the centurion demonstrates a great understanding of who Yeshua was and the authority that Yeshua possessed. He understood that because Yeshua had the authority to heal, there was no reason to doubt that he would heal, despite the traditions and the customs that would separate these two men. As such, the centurion acted on this faith, on his faith reasoning that just as I have authority over others, and I am also under the authority of others, so must Yeshua have authority or hold authority over the health of people, even over the health of his own servant. And so it is a faith grounded in that authority, but it's also a faith grounded in an understanding of the relationship between those who have authority over others. And a soldier, a centurion, certainly would understand that part of his responsibility is to watch over and ensure the security of the people under him. And there's a relationship in that authority. He understood Yeshua had a similar relationship as well in the authority that Yeshua wielded. And this is why we see Yeshua proclaim the following, Luke 7, 9-10.
When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd following him, he said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel. Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well.
Besides this, there's numerous examples of the same type of faith listed throughout the New Testament, and specifically when we go to chapter 11 of Hebrews, known as like the Hall of Faith or the heroes of the faith. The chapter accounts the numerous acts of obedience by the people of God that is found throughout the Tanakh. In each of these instances, it speaks of the individual acting because of their faith in who God is, but not just because of the expectations of the consequences of that faith. But they respond, again, they respond in faith to who God is and the relationship that exists. Let's just look at a few examples. Hebrews 11, 5 through 6 states,
By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him.
So Enoch was taken by God because of his faith, which pleased God, it says. Now notice how the writer of Hebrews emphasizes that Enoch's pleasing faith consisted of two things. It consisted first of believing that God is. That's the whole understanding of the Yoheh-Vaheh and the unspeakable, the ineffable name of God, is that God is, he simply is. And secondly, that he believed that God is a rewarder. Now, the second part may sound as if genuine faith is concerned with rewards. But notice what the writer says here. The writer of Hebrews says that God is a rewarder, and that the faith is grounded in the fact that God is a rewarder, meaning that it's a faith centered, not that God gives rewards, but the very nature of God. It's still centered on who God is and what the relationship of the individual and God is, to God is. It's not a faith that rests simply on the rewards itself. Hebrews 11, 8 through 10 gives us another example.
By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God.
So here we see Abraham, who responded to a command by God to leave his family and country and seek out a new land that would be his descendants' inheritance. Again, we do see a promise of reward attached to the act of obedience. But it was a reward that neither Abraham or even Isaac or Jacob would see fulfilled in their own lifetimes. But it's important to recognize that it was not the promise of a reward, but Abraham's understanding of who was commanding him that led him into obedience. For it is only through such faith, a faith that's grounded on, again, the relationship one has to God, not necessarily simply the rewards one is promised to receive. It's that type of faith that made it possible for Abraham to be able to go forth and sacrifice his son when he was asked to do so by God. Sacrifice this very son who Abraham had been told would be the one who would inherit the promises of the covenant. Hebrews 11, 17 through 19 reads,
By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as their sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death.
So Abraham, having already received a promise of the reward, the reward being, there's many aspects of the covenant and the promise, but we're focused specifically on the idea of the land and that idea of reward at this point. Abraham was tested again by his faith. His faith was tested. And I think what God was doing here is that he was testing to see, is Abraham's faith really grounded in the promise of the reward? Or is it grounded in me, the one who is given this promise of a reward? And in Abraham, and in Abraham's willingness to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice, Abraham was showing that he truly did trust in the relationship that he had with God. He trusted in the faithfulness and in the sovereignty of God, which could even raise the dead if necessary in order to fulfill that promise. The very thing that Abraham desired, the son to who the promise would pass on to. Because at this point when Abraham's commanded to sacrifice Isaac, it's already been revealed to him he's not going in his own lifetime to receive that reward. God had already shown that to him, and that it would be his descendants after over 400 years before it would actually come about. Abraham understood this, and even, you got to go back into Genesis 17, and I encourage you to do that on your own. Even after Ishmael had been born, and Ishmael was probably about the age of 12 or so, and God comes back and he makes the covenant and the sign of the covenant through the circumcision. At that time, God makes a promise of Isaac that there is another son to come through Sarah, and that'll be the one that the promise continues on to. Abraham says at that moment, I already have Ishmael. Why not give the promise to him? And Abraham was ready to have Ishmael become the inheritor of all the promises. But that was not God's plan, and now God does give him a son. He gives him Isaac, and now he says, give it to me. Again, seeing. Is it the rewards, or is it me that your faith is grounded in? And Abraham showed that it was the relationship. It was in God himself. Finally, one last example. We see Hebrews 11, 32 through 39, which states,
And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of the lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released, so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. They were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised.
In each of these examples of the people of great faith and the trials that they had to endure, we see that what drove their faith was a trust in who God is, and that his promises would not return void because of his holiness to keep his promise and his sovereignty to have the ability and the power to carry out those promises. And even though none of these individuals received the promises, it says there in the last verse, and by that what the author is speaking of here now, this promise is that none of them lived to see Messiah come during their lives. They still endured everything because they looked for Messiah to come. But if not during their lifetime, then at the appointed time in the future, and they would remain strong in their faith for that reason. For their faith allowed them to see beyond their own individual circumstances and realize that because of who God is, and really who God was, is, and will be, the promise will come regardless of how God intervenes in their own individual lives. Whether God does rescue them out of a fiery furnace or not, whether he gives them victory in battle or not, or whether he allows them to be stoned or to be cut in two or to be persecuted and to die a martyr. Regardless of what it would be, whether they received protection or not, rewards or not, blessings or not, punishment or not, they simply obeyed God because God deserved the obedience. These examples of an obedient faith that responds directly to the nature of God and the relationship that we have with God, rather than to the consequences of obedience, raises an important question for us as believers. I would be surprised if there is anyone here who has not at least once considered what type of life would they live if God did not require us to be a holy people, because he's holy. What limits to their behavior would they observe, and how would they act with other people if God had not given them commandments and had not given us commandments to love God and to love our neighbor? What if those theologians and those false teachers out there who claim that a loving God could never condemn anyone, and therefore universal salvation is given to everyone, whether you follow after him or not, whether you come on to the Messiah or not. What if they were correct? What would the day-to-day consequences of that be if you knew you were going to go to heaven and live eternity with God regardless of what you did? The hypothetical question that I just posed or the hypothetical question that I'm putting to you right now this morning is what would be the consequences if there were no consequences attached to obedience or sin? That although God still gave us instructions and he showed us how to live a righteous life, what if he said, this is how you live a life unto me, this is how you live a holy life, but I'm not going to be concerned whether you actually follow them. There were no promises or blessings. There's no promises of curses. There's no Mount Gerizim and no Mount Ebal. What would be the result? How would you live? How would you treat others? What would your relationship to God be like? This question had been at the beginning of today's message before we looked at faith, a faith that is able to state confidently, but if not. It would be interesting to hear the responses of our hearts, and actually more so, the responses of our flesh. How many of us would have immediately went to the sin that we struggle with most in our lives and think about our ability to indulge in it? How many would think about the pulled pork sandwich you no longer eat? How many of you would have thought about the ability to stay in bed on Saturday mornings because there's no need to come together as a holy convocation? And how many would have entertained even darker thoughts that strike at the very flesh of loving ourselves above our neighbors or loving ourselves above God? And yet, even if the first inclination of the flesh would be to consider the sin in which one could indulge, we see from the examples of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, we see from Caleb and Joshua and from the centurion who sought out Yeshua, that in reality, if we truly love God, if we truly honored and acknowledged who God is, if the blessing and curses disappear, it really shouldn't change our lives in any shape or form. Because we should still desire to obey the commandments simply because he loves us and he deserves our obedience. The answer to the but if not scenario should be the very same as the answer to the original reality. Regardless of the consequences, regardless of the promises, regardless of the punishments, the answer should be the same. But if not, we obey God's commandments. Now, history has not been kind to the memory of the Sadducees, and for good reason. They were the Jews of Yeshua's time who controlled the temple, and they consisted of a school of thought that denied the resurrection of the dead. They also denied the eternal nature of the soul. They took Torah in the most literal sense, and they also didn't view the rest of the Tanakh as having the same authority as Torah. Now, part of the reason that the Sadducees are seen in such a bad light is certainly because of these beliefs, these incorrect beliefs, but also they're seen in such a negative light because we have none of their original writings. We have no opportunity to hear their perspectives and the reasons for their own voice, or hear their reasons in their own voice. Instead, we only see them in what their opposition has to say. Now, in one type of opposition, obviously they are wrong because it was in opposition to the Messiah that we read about in the New Testament. But we also know more about the Sadducees than just what the New Testament tells us, because in the Talmud they're discussed. But that's written primarily by the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were those who opposed the Sadducees, both politically and theologically. So the only thing we know about the Sadducees is what the New Testament tells us, and then what their political opponents and their theological opponents have to say about them. To give you a modern-day example, what if the only thing you ever knew about Barack Obama was what Sean Hannity told you and you never heard another opinion? Or to flip it, What if the only thing you knew about like someone like Paul Ryan was what Chris Matthews said, and you knew nothing else? It's going to give you a biased opinion. It gives you a biased perspective. You don't hear both sides of the story, and most importantly, you don't get to hear what the person has to say in their own words. This is where we're at with the Sadducees. And despite all the Sadducees' fault, though, I do see one redeeming value in them. And it's a value that should give us pause in our own spiritual lives. Just think about it. Even though the Sadducees denied the resurrection, and they denied the eternal nature of the soul, believing our spirit was extinguished when the flesh dies, they still followed after God, or at least they tried to in their own way. They still held his commandments high, and they sought to seek after the obedience to his commandments in great zeal. And this suggests that to some degree they understood that obedience to God's commandments should be followed simply because of who God was and the Lord's relationship to the Jewish people. It wasn't because they were expecting rewards in the afterlife. It wasn't because they were expecting that if I don't, maybe my soul will be punished and I won't go into Olam Haba. They simply obeyed. So in conclusion, we should all be striving for the Vahain law faith, or the but if not faith, as demonstrated by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. While we can rest our hope in deliverance from our enemies and preservation during the trials in our lives, we should strive for a greater faith that exceeds this, though. One that, yes, expects blessings, but is content to simply be humble and to humble ourselves before God, to obey his commandments, and to obey them simply because he is worthy of such devotion and love. For once we move beyond our concerns with the consequences of obedience and rebellion, we can begin to just focus on our love for God, and we can make his commandment a matter of the heart, rather than an outward concern with our position in this life or the afterlife. Is at this moment that we as the followers of Yeshua can begin to center our efforts on nourishing our relationship with God. As John 14:21 states,
"Whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love them and show myself to them."
To that I say amen. It is our duty to praise the Master of all, to ascribe greatness to the author of creation. He made us unlike the nations of the lands and has not placed us like the families of the earth. He has not made our portion like theirs or our lot like all their multitudes. And we bend the knee and bow and acknowledge our thanks before the King over kings, the Holy One, blessed be he. He stretches out heaven and establishes earth's foundation, and the seat of his glory is in the heavens above. And the presence of his power is in the most exalted heights. He is our God, there is none other. True is our King, there is nothing beside him, as it is written in his Torah. And you shall know this day and take to your heart that the Lord, he is God, in the heavens above and on the earth below, there is none other.